Thanks so much, Tessa, and to all of the experts discussing disinformation on the continent. Part of making progress on disinformation is understanding the global nature of the challenge and actually engaging with people in every part of the world. As people in different communities, cultures, and regions confront new forms of online harms, we all benefit from learning from their innovations and responses. I'm excited to turn now to a session looking specifically at the gaps in our understanding and standards for our work across the study of information ecosystems around the world and especially online. So now over to the DFR Lab's Alyssa Kann for Misinformation.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our panel, Misinformation, Gaps in Online Research. As researchers and practitioners combating disinfo, influence operations, and other online harms, we rely on open source research to do our work and help promote public digital literacy. Yet open source research is only ever as good as the sources of info that are publicly available, and that's becoming more complicated than ever. Data access from tech companies changes based on the company's whims, not the public and researchers' needs. And disinfo spreading actors have increasingly migrated to messaging apps and less openly accessible online places. What are the current challenges facing open source research today, and how can we move past them? I'm joined today by experts in technology, journalism, and research who approach this intersectional topic from all angles. Daniel Acosta-Ramos is an investigative researcher at First Draft, where he's focused on Latinx and Spanish-speaking communities in the US. He's a journalist who's worked with media and NGOs to fight misinformation in his home country of Venezuela. Louise Marie Hurel is the digital security program lead at Igarapé Institute, a think tank focused on security in Brazil. She's also a PhD researcher in data networks and society who's done research on internet governance, privacy, security, and more. Joanna Rohozińska is the resident director of Transatlantic strategy at the International Republican Institute. She oversees their Beacon project, which focuses on democracy building and has developed a unique media monitoring tool to help them and partners do narrative tracking. Yoel Roth is the head of site integrity at Twitter, where he leads teams to detect and mitigate all sorts of threats, including misinformation and state-backed influence operations. He did his PhD dissertation research on the intersection of privacy, safety, and self-expression in online dating apps. Alicia Wanless is the director at the Carnegie Endowment's Partnership for Countering Influence Operations, which seeks to answer challenging policy questions about influence operations and better measure influence operations through research and cross-disciplinary collaborations. So we'll dive right in. Currently, what challenges exist for those who work with openly available data? Are data access trends over time heading in the wrong direction? Do you all have examples of work that was hampered by open data no longer being available? We'll hear from all the panelists, starting with Daniel.
Thank you for the invitation. And is data getting harder to find? Is our work as researchers getting harder? And the answer is yes. And this is clear when we see this trend of open data being either harder to get or basically being held hostage by not only platforms, but other developers, right? So, and we see this every single day when we're trying to research, for instance, vaccine misinformation, when we try to see which companies or which organizations are placing ads in the internet to promote anti-vaccine content, and as that content is not determined across the board to be political. We have some platforms that will let us see which ads has been placed, but others don't. So our research and getting to this data is getting more complicated. And as you said, the migration of bad actors to closed messaging apps is also a problem. And I think it's a good time to say that it's not only a problem for us researchers to get that data, but also reflecting on how getting this data can affect researchers' mental health and the vicarious trauma that can get into it. Because we see, and every day we see problematic spaces, we see terrible content in the darkest corners of the internet, and that also has an effect, a human effect on the people doing this research. So I think, yes, our work is getting harder. And sadly, yes, we have pieces of research that have been affected for unclear, opaque policies by platforms and other projects that work getting this data to us.
Yeah, those are great points. Louise, I'm curious, what are your thoughts?
Definitely. I mean, I agree 100% with what Daniel just said. I think it is becoming more and more difficult to do research. At the same time, you know, we have to be innovative of the digital and the methods that we use to kind of actually continue researching. I think the biggest question is, how do we continue researching? Because as we know, these kind of changes are kind of happening, you know, every now and then. So I think there is this adaptability element that is crucial to kind of just doing research in this space. And I would definitely say that there is, from the research community, kind of academia, there is a lack also of cross-pollination in terms of research methods. I think sometimes there is this kind of, oh, I use OSINT, I use these tools, and there's the other folks that are doing kind of network-focused research. And I think coming from the kind of the perspective of Brazil's kind of research community, I think there is a lot of kind of gaps that we're trying to kind of figure out and kind of think about how does it mean to actually use, you know, OSINT and different tools together with, you know, ethnographic methods that require you to just stay a while in these spaces sometimes and use other types of kind of methods to actually research influence operations. And I would also say, like, from personal experience, I was working with a group of other kind of scholars on looking at COVID misinformation, specifically on Instagram, and looking at how pro and anti-science narratives were proliferating in these spaces. And we were like, how do we start? I mean, should we look at the stories? How do we understand the stories? So these kinds of configurations of these different platforms kind of make it very, very hard to just think about what kinds of methods we need to mobilize to actually answer the questions that we need to answer in a moment that we're living in, you know, deep political crises, for example. So these are just some of the elements that perhaps just to start the conversation on challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. So Joanna, IRI's Beacon project has made a proprietary media monitoring tool to track narratives. Has this in part been a response to not being able to access data easily? What are your thoughts?
Yes, and hi, thank you very much for having me, and for a very analog, old-fashioned reason, which means that much of the data available and much of the social media space is English dominated. And so once you start working in languages that are outside of that, the smaller the language, the more difficult it is. And I mean, so I have to say, in fairness, the tool that we developed, we ended up retiring it because it's a different, interesting case study of the limitations of civic tech. But the reason why we created it was precisely that, was that we needed something to be able to access data in smaller languages, and especially if anybody's familiar with Slavic languages, with all the declensions within Slavic languages, which makes searching that much more difficult. So this is what we ended up. But what's interesting is that perhaps this is also going to be some lessons learned, interestingly, for the dilemma that this community is facing now with the shortages of data. A lot of the organizations and entities that we have worked with come from a sociological and anthropological background, which means that they have an analog approach to research. And for them, the other side, learning how to do data analysis and learning how to do data scraping was in fact kind of like a build out on the tool. But we have found that this kind of more holistic approach, looking at not just data, but also all the other pieces, have actually maybe helped them buffer this this closing space, because for them it was always a little bit closed anyways. So I think that, I mean, it still creates like a global dilemma, obviously, and hearing what everybody is saying. But yeah, perhaps it also gives an opportunity to be a little bit more innovative and perhaps slip away from using data as a bit of a crutch and a bit of golden ring that kind of answers everything, because that often data only gives part of the story and it doesn't give everything. And you do need to have like a good contextual understanding of the narratives that Louise was talking about, because words are only words. You have to understand what they mean in the specific context that you're looking at. And to date, I have not seen an AI tool that supplants a human intelligence. So I think that maybe it's taking a little bit of a step back. Thanks.
Yeah, that contextual fluency is so critical and yet often so hard to acquire. So Yoel, speaking of global dilemmas, Twitter has a huge user base across the world. How has Twitter kind of conceived of data access and made that possible. What are the challenges there?
Sure. First, Alyssa, thank you so much for organizing this. I'm really excited about this panel. I think when we think of access to data at Twitter, we have a long-standing tradition of making available access to all of the public content on our platform to researchers. The Twitter APIs are the dominant source of data for people who are studying social media. There's been some studies out there that have looked at academic papers that are published studying social media. And if you add up the number of papers studying every single other platform on the internet, that's almost equal to the number of papers studying Twitter. And for us, that's a source of pride. We're glad that we can enable that. But I also think it's a problem for the research community because it represents a convenience sample. I think as there's increasingly a divide between the level of access that's available from public platforms, and especially platforms that make it a point to support research, which Twitter does, by no means perfectly, but we do try to do it, and platforms that are a bit more closed, you're going to see research that gravitates increasingly in a direction of where can we get the data and evidence that we need to try and draw the conclusions we're looking to make. And when research follows the data, it's going to bias to the types of platforms that can supply it. And so you end up with research that reflects the threat actors and threat models of a platform like Twitter, which are certainly relevant and are impactful in the world, but by no means represent the entire threat landscape of social media. And so I think one of the key points for us to focus on is what can we identify as being the characteristics of effective access to data? And I think there's some things we can draw from Twitter's approach here that are instructive. And then more importantly, what can we do to try and even this out a little bit more? Maybe starting with the biggest players in the ecosystem, but also trying to figure out what the access model ought to be in a more forward-looking way so that we can try and avoid this kind of bifurcation of access to data from a small number of platforms and then everybody else who's increasingly closed.
Yeah. So Alicia, on that note, PCIO has done a lot of work looking at how to collaborate and connect industry and academia. Could you speak on that?
I could try and speak to some of the results that we've had in doing that work. Coming back to the gaps currently and the challenges faced by investigators and researchers at large. I mean, what we've seen in some of our community surveys and other efforts to engage multi-stakeholder communities is one, there is a lack of diversity and there is a lack of bridges between communities. We've been finding that consistently in trying to identify researchers in other parts of the world and whose papers tend to dominate even on those regions. They're not usually locals, and this is quite problematic. The second thing is that there's a lack of core funding. So what we've heard from many other initiatives is that most funding is project-based. So everybody's working project to project and then trying to find the next round of funding. That's just not very sustainable, and it's not going to give us a good long-term perspective as people are trying to prove that whatever they've just done was successful and should get some more money for it. The last thing on the investigation side, which tends to be problematic, is that there's a lack of research standards. There are more and more handbooks that are coming up, but there's no universal standards for how these investigations are conducted. Unlike academic research, much of the investigative work happens outside of a peer review process, but that doesn't really matter for media. It's still very sensational and it tends to get coverage regardless. So two key areas where we have big gaps are, how do you make attributions if you're not entirely certain or even partially certain? Should that be happening? And the second thing is a mistake for what is correlation for causation. So there's lots of claims that because something happened that it led to this. Now, overall, the lack of data access, which is a persistent problem, has bearing on our understanding of certain things. So like you all was saying, we get a lot of piecemeal research on case studies about specific campaigns, but we don't really understand how the information environment works as a system in total. And we're not going to get there unless we can have deeper access across platforms to understand the spread and how that changes things. The second thing is we really don't understand very well the effects of influence operations, particularly when social media is involved. As you all had said, there is some research out there. It does skew towards Twitter, but that's not, the most used social media platform in most countries. So this is problematic for understanding of effects. And moreover, understanding of effects is focused on short-term effects as a result. So we don't know the longer term effects of social media being involved with influence operations. And lastly, we know very little about the efficacy of interventions. The majority of research that's been conducted is looking at fact checking and some of the disclosure and labeling, but not much else, and very little on social media again. And why data access? It's not just about giving data access in these cases. This requires a certain level of research collaboration, protection for researchers who get involved in this so that they're not being compromised by their collaboration with platforms. It's ongoing access, and moreover, an ability to understand what tweaks platforms have made in the middle of those studies to know if they're starting to affect the outcome.
Yeah, those are all amazing and very, very prescient points. Attribution is an issue across the field, and the lack of standards is something we're all, I think, working on in different ways towards overcoming. So I want to pivot here and to kind of take some of those loose ends and talk about the ideal level of data access here. So what would, in an ideal world, how should social media companies be governed regarding data access? And how would that access specifically be granted in ways which prevent bad faith actors from abusing data? I want to start here actually with Yoel, following up on what he mentioned about how Twitter does give, has API access and shares data with researchers, for example, the unhashed election data sets. So how does Twitter conceive of these data sharing practices now? And going forward, you mentioned creating a set of shared standards across social media companies. What would that look like? And what examples from Twitter can be applied to other social media companies?
One of the cardinal principles that we have at Twitter is not just providing transparency, but providing meaningful transparency about our actions and about what's happening on our service. And the key term here is meaningful. What is the information that's going to be relevant for certain studies, for certain constituencies, and that's going to enable researchers, activists, journalists, policymakers to understand the phenomena that they're trying to study and to draw conclusions from them? One of the things that we see as a baseline is access to public information. We offer it programmatically via our APIs. We offer free access to developers. We write protections for researchers into our API TOS, which we believe is absolutely essential. We think that researchers shouldn't have to worry about whether they're going to be on the wrong side of policies created by a corporation that can afford lots of expensive lawyers. We write those protections into our rules from the beginning, and we think that's an important starting point. You have to make sure that researchers have confidence that if they're using your data in accordance with your laid out policies, that they're going to be protected and that those uses are allowed. But that's just the beginning. I think there's lots of other types of data that are important and impactful, but are a lot more challenging to navigate. One category of this is information about accounts that are removed for violations of a company's terms of service. This sort of becomes, in some situations, a bit of a cat and mouse game between platforms and researchers to see who can find something first. And it's kind of like, if the researchers find it first, then they can publish an article about it, and then the platforms are sort of caught flat-footed and have to remove it. The platforms catch it first, then we take it down, and maybe nobody will see it. At Twitter, we've tried to step outside that a little bit, especially in the domain of disinformation, by releasing data sets about the accounts that we've removed, where we are able to confidently attribute them to government influence operations. But there's lots of other spaces where things violate platform rules and would still be of interest to researchers, things that can't clearly be attributed, or terrorism and violent extremism, for instance. These are absolutely essential spaces, but they're ones where we still have some challenges and some unevenness about access. I don't think there are clear solutions to this. Our approach has been to sort of push the boundaries of some of the global privacy regulations and make this data available, because we think there's no way to do this work and not make it available. But I don't think there are clear answers that are going to work for every platform in every situation. But I do think platforms should be pushing themselves on how they can make data about this type of activity available.
Yeah. And Danielle, so you mentioned misinformation circulating on WhatsApp. So chat platforms kind of present researchers with unique challenges. Is this really a necessary needed limit to open source research? Because these platforms can't really be researched without infringing on privacy and users' rights. And what do you see kind of as an ideal level of access given these challenges?
I think the ideal level of access bears more transparency across all platforms, right? And not just transparency on what data can be available, but transparency of the standards in which platforms give that data to researchers. And I mentioned before that, for instance, some platforms, when some platforms consider ads to be political, those are treated differently. Well, that process in which the platforms consider those ads being political needs to be more transparent and more transparent across the board, not only, let's say, Facebook, Twitter, but Google, YouTube, and others. And when you mention, and this is, I think is something important, when you mention bad actors getting their hands in that data, that is a risk that, yes, it's present, it's real, but we have to be honest. Bad actors, misinformation spreaders, chronic disinformation spreaders are looking for that data, and as it's a real analogy, but as the researchers do, they also want to know and have their hands on the data. So I think that is a risk that not only researchers but activists, platforms have to measure. But overall, more transparency is needed. And when it comes to encrypted conversations such as WhatsApp, there's really little that we can do. For instance, we know that there are semi-closed groups that you can analyze, but it's still really difficult. And I think that actors notice, and they have changed their strategies to match that privacy.
Yeah, that's an important point. It's almost like there's this cycle where we release information about disinformation and malicious actors, and then those actors know that we have that information and pivot their tactics. So our field pivots tactics, and it's a kind of never-ending game of cat and mouse. So Louise, you've done work on internet governance and research on privacy security. What are your thoughts on how this data access should ideally be granted in a way that prevents or lessens bad actor access?
Yeah, I think I'm going to take a turn over here, because I think we're talking a lot about the platform itself, and I'd just like to get on Alicia's point about cross-platform understandings, just because to understand how these misinformation or influence operations occur, we're not just talking about the platform itself. We're talking about being able to trace and understand trends that transcend different platforms, and sometimes are not even specific to a particular platform. You know, most of the times we're looking, and as a researcher, we're looking at different points of like different data sources, right? So I think the challenge over here is a multidimensional one, is one of gaining access to that data through, you know, more transparent guidelines, to being able to protect the researcher, things that we already talked about. But I think it also comes from a transformation on academia, for example, of being more aware of these kind of researches, of, you know, just basic things, which are not that basic, of like getting ethics boards to actually be more sensitive to the methodologies that are being applied to these researches. So I've, you know, just from experience, I've been in touch with different researchers that have been doing, for example, research on encrypted messaging apps. And sometimes in politically sensitive environments, we're talking about covert research, which is always a huge challenge in terms of both the protection of the researcher, because if the researcher is known, then you're not going to be able to actually understand what was happening over there, and you might be kind of shut off of a particular group. So I think it comes down to like these very practical aspects that includes platforms. It's not restricted just to that, to gaining access. But if we really want to understand an information ecosystem, we need to look at that, and we need a more transparent approach from that, with clearer guidelines that also protect researchers. We need an innovation from kind of academia and from research institutions. And we also need to kind of consider governments, right? We're sometimes looking at different kind of data portals from governments. And just to give an example, over in Brazil, the whole of the .gov kind of domain was updated. All of the websites from the government were updated a while ago. And that meant that most of the databases were like we lost access to a lot of data in that process. So it's kind of a very practical example also of how do we understand the continuity of access to data across these different environments. So I just wanted to kind of zoom out, because I think, you know, sometimes we're so concerned with the platform, which I think it's very important, and you all and others have already brought in amazing points. But I do think that when we're doing research in the everyday life, I think it always comes to kind of how do you manage all of these different kind of boxes, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Zooming out is absolutely critical. So Joanna, I'm curious, what are your thoughts?
Zooming out, I think that, I mean, a lot of the points that have already been made, that obviously it's good to have like the cross platforms. I think that one thing to keep in mind is that there's no such thing as a perfect policy. And I think that because there's so many different operating environments, I have seen often the best intended transparency policies, which I do. I'm a very firm believer in the transparency, but there's always collateral damage, right? So you do have to remember that some of the people and organizations and groups that depend on the heavy encrypted are working in incredibly oppressive operating environments. And so the bad actors aren't always necessarily the users. The bad actors are sometimes the governments that want access to the users as well. So it's one of those things to keep in mind, right? I mean, I think that one of the best examples so far that could be probably learned from is the incredibly laudable anti-terrorist legislation for banking transparency in Europe. But what has ended up happening is that it's ended up closing bank accounts for human rights organizations working in the former Soviet Union, right? And having to have offshore accounts because they can't meet the transparency. Requirements. So there's always a double-edged sword, I think, right? And so I would always kind of urge a measured approach instead of rushing forward to actually look at all of these different angles. And I think that for social media companies, I do not envy you. It's one of those things that makes me very happy that I don't have to work for one, because you do have to deal with extremely radically different operating environments and a user base that is so incredibly diverse, and a lot of bad actors that come from very different places, including governments necessarily, who aren't generally regarded as bad actors, but such is the world that we live in. So.
Yeah, those are great points. Do you want to respond to those, or should we pivot to Alicia?
No, I would just note that I think the diversity of user expectations is something we should bear in mind. I think many people who choose to use a public platform like Twitter do so because it's public and because they go seeking an audience that you can find on a platform like Twitter. That's not everybody. And there's going to be divergent expectations of privacy, even within the community of Twitter users, which, as a reminder, is not the entire internet. And so we're actually talking about many different communities of people with different risk profiles, to Joanna's incredibly important point, with different expectations of the publicness or lack thereof of their information, and with different goals for their use of media. And I think that complicates any attempt to create, in sort of a top-down regulatory way, a regime that mandates certain types of access and transparency. It doesn't work in a sense of mapping onto the expectations that people bring to the table here. So an incredibly important intervention, I think, from Joanna.
And Alicia, do you want to pick that up?
Sure. I think, so we're talking a lot here about data access, but very seldom is it articulated what data we're talking about. And there's a lot of different types of data that could be had from social media companies and elsewhere, service providers and things related to the internet. And so part of the issue here is that we don't even really know what data exists internally. Unless you've gone inside and worked with a company, you're probably not going to have that level of insight. And even inside a company, if it's a very big, sprawling one, knowing everything that they have is problematic, is really challenging. And we could be talking here about policy enforcement, user data, things within the platform, how it's tweaked and set up to deliver information. And one of the reasons why we're still in this kind of hole, I think, is that everything is ad hoc. This is an emerging field. So not just fundraising, but partnerships and access to data are all done almost entirely on an ad hoc basis at this point, which isn't really great for consistency. So what's really missing is a wider permanent framework or structure to be able to handle data access over time. So not just in a limited time, so we can see what's actually been changing, but also managing collaboration between industry, researchers, and policymakers. So there is a feedback loop that we're actually managing to govern the information environment in a meaningful way. But then coordinating that is a beast, right? This is about managing the entire process, vetting which researchers should have access. And that doesn't mean they should always have access if they run afoul, but also in the contracting and fundraising to be able to support this level of research. The only thing that comes to mind as being something feasible to handle it at this scale would be the equivalent of a CERN for the information age, a multinational organization funded by several different governments that has cooperation and support from industry across the board, such that we could get to this deeper level of understanding. And if it were to be international, we could actually bake in some of the sensitivities that are missed from having a predominantly North American viewpoint on creating policies in those platforms.
Those are great points. So I'd like to pivot slightly now and look towards the future. So particularly thinking about what Joanna said in regards to authoritarianism and threats to democracies. We've seen entire countries, for example, go offline as governments block social media access to prevent the public from sharing what's happening on the ground. If you were to extend or make any predictions based on the current situation, what do you think is going to be the future of open source research? Danielle, do you want to start?
I think the future is both bright but harder, right? I think not just the data, but the human resource that we need, it's going to find big challenges in the future, and those are not unique to platforms, but there's also unique to the projects that we so to resolve and the things that we want to show to the world. So I think the challenges have to do with access. The challenges have to do with basically communicating the needs that researchers have to big platforms and governments to find the data that is needed. And I also think, and this is something that we don't usually think about, but it's also important to think about the human tool that this kind of research has on researchers and the big teams and the vicarious drama that might be associated with it. So we have to have several conversations on access, on mental health, and more transparency. But we also need to be having real conversations with other researchers and with other groups that are doing the same research that we are doing in order to, as Alicia said, have a little bit more of a standard across the industry, which is new.
Great. Louisa?
Just picking up on Daniel's point of actually kind of having that conversation across different research communities. I think that is crucial going forward. Just from the experience of PCIO, and I'll just nudge Alicia on that. We had several conversations throughout, last year, which seems like a time vortex right now. But we had several conversations with both Brazilian scholars, but also trying to create that cross-pollination between what does it mean to study influence operations and misinformation campaigns in, let's say, Brazil and in other countries. Is there something there for us to think about cross-pollination of methods and experiences in doing this research in Brazil and doing this research in the US, in other countries? I think there is a lot of gaps in these terms that we are working to kind of fill. And we definitely see, I definitely saw a lot of the benefits of doing that. And I think it's very practical. But again, there is a need for funding in order to create that sustainable element in the longer run. But I would just wanted to kind of stress that point because, for example, in the Brazil's case, there is a lot of, as I said, focus on doing network analysis sometimes, on doing kind of a more investigative journalism approach to misinformation campaigns. But the discussion on attribution, sometimes it's still kind of in the process of developing. I think there is a need for capacity building when it comes to, for example, knowing how to use open source intelligence tools. So these are kind of like gaps that can be filled by these different dialogues, and also building trust with industry at that particular level.
Joanna?
So I wonder about fatigue, frankly. And part of it is just because there are so many conversations happening and within different subgroups, if you want. So yes, there should be more, and there should be more across platforms, but I think that with Alicia, we were talking about this a little while ago, is that, you know, at a certain point you just unplug and you stop listening, because we've heard the same conversations to a large extent for the past 5-6 years, and it's getting a little tiring. And if it's tiring for us who are engaged in this on a daily basis and quite vested, then you can only imagine that at a certain point, the wider public kind of goes, well, who cares, right? So that's all really interesting, that there's these groups that are meeting on social media and plotting the destruction and the downfall of civilization. But so what are you going to do about it, right? Like, how much data are you going to give us about it? How many investigations are you have? What of it? What comes out of all of it? And in terms of, so I will say full disclosure. So I used to work on the donor side for 15 years. And so I understand what the gaps in financing is, and kind of like how, and unfortunately how pragmatically donors do work sometimes, because we have our own donors to report to. And it would be lovely to think that there's going to suddenly be a radical change in approach that would allow these multidisciplinary, international, very long scale and large scale projects to exchange research, but I really don't think that that's going to happen very much. If there's more resources that come from, for example, social media companies, that's one thing, but that comes with its own price as well, right? So I think that it also ends up kind of closing into a cottage industry, because at a certain point you kind of think, so all of these interesting discussions are for who? Who are you aiming them at, and what do you want to do apart from feeding your own community? So I think that this is going to be a little bit of a challenge going through, because I mean, there's also, and it'll be my last point, with the attribution issues, with the kind of blurring of the lines between what intelligence operations are versus homegrown domestic disinformation versus conspiracy theories that are fed by, you know, social dislocation and discontent on a very domestic level for very basic and kind of understandable reasons. It becomes such a difficult thing to start pulling apart, that on one hand it's tiring, and on the other hand, a lot of the reason why there's so much confluence is because the root cause or the root question ends up being, so why do people believe these things, and why do they function? And very often the answer is because there are fissures in society that are exacerbated by this kind of disinformation, and it feeds it. But the fix to it is actually really quite complicated and long-term, and has nothing to do with the digital world, unfortunately. So I think that, you know, and as there's kind of increasing realizations about that, I think, I won't say that it threatens the entire, but it just means that I think that we have to rethink a little bit how you engage audiences outside of this very specialized audience.
Yeah, absolutely. Data access is one thing, and the offline world is so much thornier, unfortunately. Yoel, closing points?
Yeah, I want to pick up on that point, because I think it's really essential to everything we're talking about here. Having access to data is the first step, but then the question is, who's able to meaningfully shape the public conversation about what that data is actually signifying? To give one concrete example, when Twitter first started publishing our large-scale data sets on state disinformation, the first day that we uploaded you know, a few hundred gigs of content associated with the IRA, I got an email from a number of reporters at different outlets saying, I tried to open these files in Excel on my computer and my laptop crashed. And so even within the community of specialists working on these issues, there's unevenness in terms of access to work with and understand that data. That problem is magnified 10-fold or 100-fold or 1,000-fold when it comes to the public's access to and understanding of this information. And it's absolutely a space of conflict. You see the very bad actors that the open source community and platforms are trying to combat using these disclosures as an opportunity to say, this is bias. They engage in some attempt to work the ref in these situations and say, these are platforms weaponizing transparency to further their own goals. These are groups like Bellingcat weaponizing what they claim is publicly available evidence in order to further a political agenda. And in a space where you can't really work with the data directly because there's not enough RAM in your laptop to open the file in Excel, who's to say? And it kind of creates this ambient environment of uncertainty and unease and distrust, which doesn't get at the offline problems we're trying to address here. So yes, of course, data access is the first step. But the next step is showing up and actually framing the conversation in a way that makes it accessible, because there is a reality external to the conversation about it that's playing out in media. And I think it's really important that the data is brought to bear in those conversations in an effective and successful way.
Absolutely. Alicia.
So, I mean, I agree with everything I've just heard. Realistically, I think that this field will continue to grow for a bit, and then it will shrink just like the countering violent extremism world has before it. And this is also part of the problem, is that there are many other fields that could and should be drawn from, but we're not necessarily building that capacity together. And collaboration is great. We obviously need more of that. We need more articulation of standards for investing in a space, but collaborations don't happen in a vacuum. You need some sort of glue that brings them together. And this is generally missing. One of the biggest problems I've seen moving from different sectors is that there's not a lot of great understanding between sectors. We don't have the generalists in between that can make the translation between, say, industry, academia, and policy. And this is a huge gap. And so we kind of have to foster that now in order for this to work. And to our end, what we are trying to do are small bits. We launched an Influence Operations Researchers Guild, which is attempting to bring this community together, articulate these standards together, and then share that knowledge around the world. So.
And on that note, we have a few minutes left, and I'm going to pivot to audience questions. We have one for Yoel. Have there ever been any discussions in Twitter to provide additional unique identifier data for some of your state-sponsored data sets that have been taken down that might include IP login data or the email addresses created and used by inauthentic actors? Since these accounts would be considered state-sponsored and already suspended, would there be harm in providing more data that could help with attributions?
Yeah, if the question is, have there been discussions? The answer is yes, every day, all the time. But I'll sort of zoom out a little bit and say the question of sources and methods is a really challenging one for us, and one that we wrestle with on the transparency side, because this is an adversarial environment. While it's true that we are taking extraordinary transparency steps in the domain of state-backed IO, we also want to make sure that we're not inadvertently making it harder for ourselves to catch the next generation of IO that's carried out by these actors. Like any security risk, we don't harbor the belief that we're going to solve this problem, or that one day IO is going to go away. It is an ongoing threat. And so in that situation, we want to provide as much transparency as we can without compromising our ability to continue to do that work. And so certainly things like email addresses, IP addresses, phone numbers, those are the types of signals that a sophisticated adversary is going to expect we're using, but we're going to not rush to release information that would make it even easier for people to try and get around our systems and technologies that are built to detect IO. It's a balancing act, though.
Yeah, and speaks to that paradox. So another question, what are some of the challenges you all are seeing with current OSINT tools and techniques as a lot of IPv4 data continues to migrate to IPv6? What are some of the tools you'd all recommend to analyze and assess the newer IPv6 data? And no one wants to take this. We have another question as well. Okay, so where does language feature in terms of empowering researchers, particularly with multinational agencies? When are language issues perceived as censorship? And I think building off that question, if I can pivot it a little, there are a lot of language access issues with open data sets, right? Because the data is so global. What are issues there? We've already touched a little about them that we are working towards solving.
I'll jump in on the language thing, but it doesn't quite sound like it was related to that particular question as it was tied to censorship. But one of the problems is using language analysis tools. If they haven't been built up to work for another language, then you can't actually apply that. Fortunately, we were lucky in a project that we're sponsoring or we're supporting in Brazil with the research community that Louise was mentioning, in that the tool that was available has been adopted for Brazilian Portuguese. And so we're able to use it, but this isn't common. And the smaller the language, the harder this becomes to do. Same with a lot of the scanning tools as well.
Yeah, and then last question. Oh, sorry, Daniel.
No, I will just agree to that, and I'll just personal experience doing research in Spanish is even though Spanish is not a small language, it's just for millions and millions of people around the world. We see every single day that not just the monitoring, but the tools and the platform, the platform's action with other languages that other than English is just inefficient. So that's something that we have to have in mind. And if it's inefficient in Spanish, I can just only imagine how inefficient could it be in other languages with less users.
Yeah. Joanna?
And I'll add that language is three-dimensional, right? If I can put it that way. So it's not just that you've got words, and it's not just that you've got language, but it also tends to mean something else, right? And I think this is kind of like where we start looping back to the human element, I think, a little bit as well, is that you have to understand what you're hearing or what you're reading sometimes, and it's not always quite that obvious.
Yeah. And then last question, with 30 seconds left. Joanna makes an important point about data on social media disinformation. Is there any discussion on proactive ways to change or influence narratives rather than trying to deplatform actors? Do you have suggestions? And I think that also speaks to the context point.
I have yet to see a super effective counter narrative efforts, right? I mean, the difficulty is that it depends on how you want to define it, right? But it's very rare that you can fight propaganda with counter propaganda. It's just, it ends up in a nil, right? And I think that the difficulty also is that with disinformation, once it's already out there, you're already working against time, which means that essentially you're trying to prove something that's not true, which means that you're arguing that you're not a camel. And so it ends up being kind of a waste of time, I think, right? I mean, I know that there's a number of researchers that are trying to develop AI capabilities to predict narratives coming up based on kind of like, it's almost kind of like a conflict forecasting, yeah? So you're getting away from the data, but you're using a different approach, I think, which is interesting, and potentially, but ultimately, I think that it's sticking to the kind of like core truths, I think, right? I mean, as corny as it may sound, but to stick to transparency and to stick to the human rights and to stick to your principles and make sure that you don't create holes in the narrative that you have already woven that are easy to kind of take advantage of. So I don't think that there's a super great solution to it, but that's probably what I would say.
Great. So thank you so much to all our panelists. This conversation has been so fascinating. It raises so many challenges that we're thinking about for much, much longer time. I'm going to pass this off to Anna and Lucas for our next session, which is Catch 'em If You Can, a Digital Sherlock's geolocation training.